If you've ever been part of the international baccalaureate world, you know planning is a huge deal. But is it really just about ticking boxes to get ready for an evaluation? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain on the IB's Program Standards and Practices, what they call the PSP, to show you how it flips planning on its head. It goes from a simple checklist to a collaborative blueprint for learning. Let's dive in.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to tackle that old checklist way of thinking and introduce a totally new perspective. Then, we'll unpack the actual framework that brings this whole philosophy to life. After that, we'll see how these big ideas actually translate into the day-to-day work of designing a curriculum, check out some real-world examples from different IB programs, and finally, we'll nail down exactly what makes the IB approach to planning so unique.
Okay, so let's start with the biggest shift of all. For a long time, a lot of educators kind of saw the IB standards as this big hurdle. A long checklist you had to get through before an evaluation team showed up. But that completely misses the whole point. The modern way to see it is not as a list of separate tasks, but as a living, breathing, interconnected ecosystem. And this quote from a veteran IB educator, Erin Albright, it just perfectly captures that aha moment. When she first saw the new standards, she didn't see more paperwork or more hoops to jump through. She saw a gift. It was a framework that finally put into words the kind of school she'd been trying to build all along. So suddenly, it wasn't a report card, it was a map to guide the journey. This Lego analogy absolutely nails the difference. The old checklist view is like someone just handing you a big pile of Lego bricks. Sure, you can check that all the pieces are there, but there's no vision, no plan. The new ecosystem view is like seeing the finished model on the box, a structure where every single brick connects to another with a clear purpose. It shifts the whole mindset from just complying with rules to intentionally designing something amazing. So if we're going to build this amazing educational ecosystem, what's the blueprint? Well, that's exactly what the PSP framework is. It's the architectural plan that shows how every single piece works together to create something that's truly cohesive.
And this whole framework is built on 4 pillars that are all connected, and each one answers a really basic question. First up, you've got purpose. Why are we even here? Next, environment. Where does all the learning happen? Then, culture. How do we all work together? And right there, at the very center of it all, is learning. What do our students actually do and experience? Everything else is built to support that core.
Everything, and I mean everything, starts with purpose. And that's the IB's mission statement. This isn't just some nice-sounding phrase you put on a plaque in the lobby. It's the school's North Star. Every decision, from a single lesson plan to a huge school policy, has to be able to trace its roots right back to this fundamental why. Next up is the environment, the physical where of learning. And listen, this goes way beyond just the classrooms. We're talking about the daily schedule, the technology available, the library resources, even how the budget is allocated. These are all the practical, tangible structures that have to be in place to make great learning even possible. Then you have culture, the how of the school. You can think of it like the school's personality. This is where all those policies on things like academic integrity, language, inclusion become so important. They're not just documents sitting in a binder. They're the tools that a school uses to build a positive, ethical community where that IB philosophy can really take root and grow. Okay, so now let's zoom in on the absolute heart of this blueprint, learning. This is the spot where all that high-level philosophy gets real and translates directly into the daily work of teachers. This is all about the planning process. And that brings us to a really important question, right? We've got these 4 big, inspiring pillars, but how do they actually become concrete, specific things a school and its teachers have to do? How do you get from a big idea to a specific requirement for a unit plan? Well, the answer is in this really clever 4-step hierarchy. It basically acts like a funnel. You start with a big aspirational standard, something like designing a coherent curriculum. That gets narrowed down into a specific practice, like teachers collaborate. That practice then becomes a non-negotiable requirement for the school. And finally, a specification spells out exactly how that requirement looks in each specific IB program. It's a brilliant system for making big ideas actionable. So of all the different standards, there is one that really is the engine room for teacher planning, and it's that one we just mentioned, designing a coherent curriculum. This is where all the theory really becomes practice. And this standard is built on 3 core practices that just feed into each other in a continuous cycle. It starts with the plan. making sure the curriculum actually connects learning from one year to the next. The only way to make that happen is to collaborate. People have to work together. And finally, you have to communicate that curriculum to everybody, which of course then helps you make the next plan even better. And this is where the rubber really hits the road. We can see just how serious the IB is about collaboration. This isn't just a friendly suggestion. It's mandated. The school must give teachers time to plan together. Teachers must collaborate on their units, and that planning must look for connections between different subjects. It's not just a nice to have. Collaboration is literally written into the DNA of IB planning. So we know that collaboration is a universal principle across all of the IB. But what does it actually look like in a school day-to-day? Well, that's where things get interesting because the application is actually tailored for the different philosophies and age groups of the IB programs. This table gives us a great snapshot of how that one core principle gets adapted. You can kind of see this trade-off between structure and flexibility. So the middle years program, the MYP, has a mandated planner to make sure there's consistency, but the primary and diploma programs give schools more choice. The PYP is pretty structured. You've got 6 big units a year to make sure young kids get a really holistic experience. The DP, on the other hand, trusts its expert teachers to cover these really deep syllabi without even requiring a formal unit structure. Each approach is built for the kids in that program. And let's just pause on this one key distinction for a second because it's so important. In the primary years program, planning is transdisciplinary. The best way to think about it is like a smoothie. All the different subjects are just blended together to explore one big central idea. But in the middle years, it's interdisciplinary. This is more like a salad. You can still see the individual subjects, like the lettuce and the tomatoes, but the focus is all on how they connect and work together. It's a subtle difference, but it's a really powerful one. Okay, so let's zoom back out one last time and tie this all together. What is the one fundamental difference in the IB's approach to planning? It really comes down to seeing the big picture first. And that really brings us to the core difference. So much of traditional planning is all about the lesson, a narrow tactical plan for what's going to happen in the next 45 minutes. The IB approach, though, it forces you to start with the unit, a broad, strategic blueprint that covers weeks of learning and is focused on deep conceptual understanding. So in other words, a lesson plan tells you the steps for the day, an IB unit plan is the architectural design for the whole building. So after all that, we're left with this one final, really important question. When you think about the IB's deep emphasis on collaboration and building a coherent journey for students, every educator really has to ask themselves, is my planning just a document that I have to fill out? Or is it the start of a living, breathing conversation? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.